Proto-Indo-European verbs had a complex system, with verbs categorized according to their aspect, stative, imperfective, or perfective. The system used multiple grammatical moods and voices, with verbs being conjugated according to person, number and tense. The system of adding affixes to the base form of a verb allowed modifications that could form nouns, verbs or adjectives. The verbal system is clearly represented in ancient Greek and Vedic Sanskrit, which closely correspond in nearly all aspects of the verbal systems, and are two of the most well understood of the early daughter languages of Proto-Indo-European. Besides the addition of affixes, another way that vowels in the word could be modified was the Indo-European ablaut, which is still visible in languages such as the Germanic languages. For example, the vowel in the English verb to sing varies according to the conjugation of the verb sing, sang and sung. Overview. The system described here is known as the categorized system and, strictly speaking, applies only to what Don Ringe terms Western Indo-European, i.e., excluding Tocharian and especially Anatolian. The system also describes Tocharian fairly well, but encounters significant difficulties when applied to Hittite and the other Anatolian languages. In particular, despite the fact that the Anatolian languages are the earliest attested IE languages, much of the complexity of the categorized system is absent from them. In addition, contrary to the situation with other languages with relatively simple verbal systems, such as Germanic, there is little or no evidence of the missing forms having ever existed. Furthermore, many of the forms that do exist have a significantly different meaning from elsewhere. For example, the perfect stative conjugation shows up simply as a present tense conjugation known as the high present, with no clear meaning. On the other hand, the new present, which in other languages is a primary verb suffix with no clear meaning, is in Hittite a productive secondary verb suffix that forms causative verbs. It is generally accepted that the Anatolian languages diverged from other IE languages at a point somewhat before the categorized system was fully formed. However, there is no consensus concerning what the inherited system looked like, and which Anatolian differences are innovations versus archaisms. In general, the traditional categorized system reconstructs the following categories for Proto-Indo-European: person, first, second, third; number, singular, dual, plural; voice, active, middle; mood, indicative, subjunctive, optative, imperative, possibly also injunctive; aspect, imperfective, perfective, stative, tense, present, past. Some of these categories tended to drop out in time, while some languages innovated new categories. The original interpretation of the tense and aspect categories has been a thorny issue. See below. Proposed endings. At least the following sets of endings existed: primary endings, used for the present tense of the indicative mood of imperfective verbs, the subjunctive mood; secondary endings, used for the past tense of the indicative mood of imperfective verbs, the indicative mood of perfective verbs; the optative mood; stative endings, used for the indicative mood of stative verbs; imperative endings, used for the imperative mood of all verbs. Note that, from a diachronic standpoint, the secondary endings were actually the more basic ones, while the primary endings were formed from them by adding a suffix, originally I in the active voice and R in the middle voice. The more central subfamilies of Indo-European have innovated by replacing the middle voice R with the I of the active voice. Traditional accounts say that the first-person singular primary ending is the only form where athematic verbs used a different ending from thematic verbs. Newer accounts by Silla, Fortson and Ringe are similar, with the proto-forms modernized using laryngeal notation. Silla, however, notes that many of the most archaic languages have third-person singular forms missing a t and proposes an alternative t-less thematic ending along with the standard ending. Greek and Balto-Slavic have t-less forms in thematic actives, whereas Vedic and Hittite have t-less athematic middle forms. Beeks uses the t-less forms as the starting point for a radical rethinking of the thematic endings, based primarily on Greek and Lithuanian. These proposals are still controversial, however. Active eventive endings, middle eventive endings, stative endings. A second conjugation has been proposed in J. Jasanoff's H-E conjugation theory. Verb aspects. Proto-Indo-European verbs belong to one of three aspect classes. Stative verbs depicted a state of being. Eventive verbs expressed events. These could be further divided between perfective verbs depicting actions viewed as punctual, an entire process without attention to internal details, completed as a whole or not completed at all. No distinction in tense was made. Imperfective verbs depicting durative, ongoing or repeated action with attention to internal details. This included the time of speaking. Separate endings were used for present-future events in contrast to past events. The distinction between imperfective and perfective verbs was somewhat similar to the distinction found in the modern Slavic languages, although the two phenomena are unrelated. In the Slavic languages, the present tense of perfective verbs functions as a future tense, whereas in Pi the perfective verbs simply had no present tense at all, and were effectively tenseless. The terminology around the stative, perfective and imperfective aspects can be confusing. The use of these terms here is based on the reconstructed meanings of the corresponding forms in Pi and the terms used broadly in linguistics to refer to aspects with these meanings. In traditional Pi terminology, the forms described here as stative, perfective and imperfective are known as the perfect, aorist and present systems. The present imperfective system in turn can be conjugated in two tenses, described here as present and past but traditionally known as present and imperfect. The traditional terms are based on the names of the corresponding forms in ancient Greek, and are still commonly encountered. Furthermore, there is a separate secondary verb form commonly known as the stative and marked by a suffix *a, which has no connection with the stative perfect described here. The following table shows the two systems of terminology. It must be noted that in Proto-Indo-European, the aspects had no tense meaning, like they did in the later languages. In ancient Greek, for example, the perfect carried the meaning of a state resulting from a past action, but the Pi stative referred to the state alone. Likewise, the aorist, though having a tense-like meaning in ancient Greek, had none in Pi. Perfective and stative verbs were effectively tenseless, or indifferent to time. Eventive verbs. The perfective and imperfective aspect classes are together known as eventive, or verbs that depict events, to distinguish them from stative. Both shared the same conjugation, with some small differences. The main difference was that imperfective verbs allowed the use of special present tense endings, while perfective verbs only allowed the default tenseless endings. The present tense used the primary eventive endings, and was used specifically to refer to present events, although it could also refer to future events. The past tense referred to past events, and used the secondary eventive endings. Perfective verbs always used the secondary endings, but did not necessarily have a past tense meaning. The secondary endings were, strictly speaking, tenseless, even in imperfective verbs. This meant that past endings could also be used with a present meaning, if it was obvious from context in some way. This use still occurred in Vedic Sanskrit, where where in a sequence of verbs only the first might be marked for present tense, while the remainder was unmarked. If the verbs were subjunctive or optative, the mood markings might likewise be only present on the first verb, with the others not marked for mood. In ancient Greek, Armenian and Indo-Iranian, the secondary endings came to be accompanied by a prefixing particle known as the augment, reconstructed as *e or *he. The function of the augment is unclear, but it was not a fixed part of the inflection as it was in the later languages. In Homeric Greek, many imperfect and aorist verbs are still found lacking the augment. Its use became mandatory only in later Greek. Morphologically, the indicative of perfective verbs was indistinguishable from the past indicative of imperfective verbs, and it is likely that in early stages of pi, these were the same verb formation. At some point in the history of pi, the present tense was created by creating the primary endings out of the secondary endings. Not all verbs came to be embellished with these new endings. For semantic reasons, some verbs never had a present tense. These verbs were the perfective verbs, while the ones that did receive a present tense were imperfective. Stative verbs signified a current state of being rather than events. It was traditionally known as perfect, a name which was assigned based upon the Latin tense before the stative nature of the Proto-Indo-European form was fully known. While Latin conflated the concept with tense, in pi there was no association with any particular tense. The stative aspect was marked formally with its own personal endings, which differed from the eventives by a root in the singular in O grade, but elsewhere in zero grade, and typically by reduplication. Like the perfective verbs, stative verbs were tenseless, and described a state without reference to time. This did not mean that stative verbs referred to permanent states, but rather that there was no way to express, within the verbal morphology, whether the state was applicable in the present moment, in the past, or in the future. These nuances were, presumably, expressed using adverbs. In many daughter languages, the stative took on a meaning that implied a previous action that had caused the current state, a meaning which resulted in the Greek perfect. Eventually, by shifting emphasis to the intuitive action, an action that was just started or a state that was just begun prior to the resulting state, the stative generally developed into a past tense. The original present sense of the i.e. stative is seen in the Germanic preterite present verbs such as Gothic wait I know and lt pi *woidhe. Originally, I am in a state resulting from having seen, found, cf. Latin videre, to see, Sanskrit finiti, he finds, with exact cognates in Sanskrit Veda and ancient Greek oida, all of which retain their essentially present tense meaning, I know. Other verbal categories. Voice mood. The moods of pi included indicative, imperative, subjunctive, optative and perhaps injunctive. Indicative. The indicative mood was the default mood, and, alongside the imperative, the oldest. It was used for simple statements of fact. The indicative mood was the only mood to have distinctions in tense in imperfective verbs. All other moods were tenseless. The present tense used the primary endings, while the past tense used the secondary endings, as did the indicative of perfective verbs. Stative verbs used their own, entirely different set of endings in the indicative mood. Imperative. The imperative mood was used for commands directed towards other people, and therefore only occurred in the second and third person. It used its own set of special imperative endings. Subjunctive. The subjunctive mood was used to describe completely hypothetical events, along the lines of, suppose that I oversleep. It was also sometimes used for future events. For this reason, The subjunctive was formed by adding the thematic vowel to the stem, along with primary endings, with the stem in the e grade. The subjunctive of athematic verbs was thus thematic, and morphologically indistinguishable from a thematic indicative. For verbs that were already thematic, a second thematic vowel was added after the first, creating a long thematic vowel. Optative. The optative mood was used for wishes or hopes, like the English "May I sleep well." It was formed with an athematic ablating suffix y acute h tilde ih attached to the zero grade of the stem. In Vedic Sanskrit, optatives were very rarely found for characterized stems. Most occurrences of the optative are in root verbs. This is taken by Silla to indicate that the optative was not really a mood in pi, but a separate verb, and was thus restricted to being derived directly from roots only, not from already derived verbs. In addition, it appears that in pi itself, stative verbs did not have the optative mood. It was limited to preventive verbs. Early Indo-Iranian texts mostly lack attestations of stative optative forms. Injunctive. The place of the injunctive mood of obscure function is debated. It takes the form of the bare root in e grade with secondary endings, without the prefixed augment that was common to forms with secondary endings in these languages. The injunctive was thus entirely without tense marking. This causes Fortson to suggest that the use of the injunctive was for gnomic expressions or in otherwise timeless statements. Verb formation. From any particular root, verbs could be derived in a variety of means. In the most conservative Indo-European languages, there is a separate set of conjugational classes for each of the tense aspect categories, with no general relationship obtaining between the class of a given verb in one category relative to another. The oldest stages of these languages reveal clear remains of an even less organized system, where a given verb root might have multiple ways, or no way at all, of being conjugated in a given tense aspect category, sometimes with meanings that differ in unpredictable ways. This clearly suggests that the tense aspect categories originated as separate lexical verbs, part of a system of derivational morphology, and only gradually became integrated into a coherent system of inflectional morphology, which was still incomplete at the time of the proto-language. There were a variety of means by which new verbs could be derived from existing verbal roots, as well as from fully formed nominals. Most of these involved adding a suffix to the root, but there were a few more peculiar formations. One formation that was relatively productive for forming imperfective verbs, but especially stative verbs, was reduplication, in which the initial consonants of the root were duplicated. Another notable way of forming imperfective verbs was the nasal infix, which was inserted within the root itself rather than affixed to it. Root verbs. The most basic verb formation was derived directly from the root, with no suffix, and expressed the meaning of the root itself. Such root verbs could be either athematic or thematic. It was not predictable which type was used. The aspect of a root verb was determined by the root, which had its own root aspect inherent in the basic meaning of the root. Thus, there were verbal roots whose default meaning was durative, ongoing, or iterative, and verbs derived from them were generally imperfective in aspect. Roots whose meaning was punctiliar or discrete created perfective aspect verbs. Stative roots were rare. Perhaps the only reconstructible stative root verb was *oid. No. There are numerous unexplained surprises in this system, however. The common root *hs meant to be, which is an archetypically stative notion, yet aspect-wise, it was an imperfective root, and thus formed an imperfective root verb *he acute st, rather than a stative verb. primary derivations. In early Pi, the aspect system was less well developed, and root verbs were simply used in the root aspects, with various derivational formations available for expressing more specific nuances. By late Pi, however, as the aspect system evolved, the need had arisen for verbs of a different aspect than that of the root. Several of the formations, which originally formed distinct verbs, gradually came to be used as aspect-switching derivations, whose primary purpose was to create a verb of one aspect from a root of another aspect. This led to a fundamental distinction in Pi verb formations between primary and secondary formations. Primary formations included the root verbs and the derivational formations that came to be used as aspect-switching devices, while secondary formations remained strictly derivational and retained significant semantic value. For example, the secondary suffix *la derived causative verbs, and retained this purpose and meaning throughout the descendants of Pi. The common primary suffix *e, however, came to be used for the majority of verb formations in Latin, without any discernible meaning being conveyed by the suffix. Its function had become purely morphological. A verb needed no derivational or aspect-switching markers for its own root aspect. Affixes of various types were used to switch the inherent aspect to a different type. Such affixes created characterized verb formations, contrasting with the basic root or uncharacterized formation. Examples of aspect-switching affixes include ye, sk, acute, and the nasal infix, all of which were used to derive imperfective verbs from roots whose inherent aspect was not already imperfective. Conversely, the s-aorist formation used the suffix s to create perfective verbs. Many roots were hypercharacterized, however, with an aspect marker added to a root that already had the correct aspect. This may have been done in order to emphasize the aspect. For example, the s-aorist also seemed to have been used when the verb root was inherently perfective already. A root did not necessarily have verbs to express all three aspects. There were many roots that seem to have had verbs for only one or two aspects in Pi. For example, the root *hs-to-be seems to have formed only an imperfective verb. No perfective or stative verbs derived from this root can be reconstructed. Various later languages amended this situation differently as needed, often by using entirely different roots. Latin used the root *buh to fill in as the perfective aspect of *hs, while the Germanic languages used the root *hwes to live, to reside in that role. While several aspect switches were available to be added to the root, particular markers were not exclusively assigned to any root. Certain roots did show preference from the same markers in multiple daughter languages, but the use of a particular marker was not exclusive, and a variety of formations are often found for the same root. For example, the basic root for stand *stare was a perfective root. Therefore, the root verb had the punctual sense of come to a standing position, to rise from a sitting position. In order to speak about standing in a present durative sense, the root verb required a derivational marker to put it into the imperfective aspect. For this root, the imperfective aspect switcher was often reduplication. But the Germanic languages also show a nasal infix suffix for this root, at least by a later period. The Slavic languages, meanwhile, also have a form derived with the ye suffix. Such discrepancies suggest that in Pi proper, this root had no imperfective verb at all, and the aspect-switched verbs we see in the later descendants descendants were formed independently of each other. Many primary formations retained some residue of their original derivational function and meaning, and significant relics of this earlier derivational system can be reconstructed for pi. The perfective root *gm to step is reconstructible with two different imperfective derivations *gmsk acute and *gmy. Both formations survived side by side in Greek, suggesting that they did not overlap significantly enough in meaning throughout the history for one or the other to fall out of use. Secondary derivations. Secondary verbs were formed either from primary verb roots or from nouns or adjectives. Deverbal formations included causative, iterative, inceptive, desiderative. The formation of secondary verbs remained part of the derivational system and did not necessarily have completely predictable meanings. They are distinguished from the primary formations by the fact that they generally are part of the derivational rather than inflectional morphology system in the daughter languages. However, as mentioned above, this distinction was only beginning to develop in Pi. Not surprisingly, some of these formations have become part of the inflectional system in particular daughter languages. Probably the most common example is the future tense, which exists in many daughter languages but in forms that are not cognate, and tend to reflect either the Pi subjunctive or a Pi desiderative formation. Secondary verbs were always imperfective, and had no corresponding perfective or stative verbs, nor was it possible to derive such verbs from them. This was a basic constraint in the verbal system that prohibited applying a derived form to an already derived form. Evidence from the Rig Veda indicates that secondary verbs in Pi were not conjugated in the subjunctive or optative moods. This suggests that these moods follow the same constraint, and are derivational in origin. The later Indo-European languages worked around these limitations, but each in their own way.